Welcome, everyone. We are so grateful to have you at our COVID session, Err on the Side of Caution. And I asked to have welcome you because I really wanted to take a moment to thank our COVID response team, both internally and externally, who have been putting these on, preparing us internally to serve you as best that we can, the workers of Ontario. And it's really tireless, their efforts, and it's hard to name names, but a lot of them are present today. Many of them are not, and they're in the background, and they're answering your inquiries and helping wherever they can. And I really thought it was important to take a moment and thank that internal and external COVID response team. John and Kevin have been in the forefront with some of the Best Brains activity and pandemic survey response and keeping us up to date on research and science through Kevin's Workplace Health Without Borders and John's keeping all of our research up to date. And our teams, our directors, our occupational health nurses, and I was reminded by Alec to mention the strength of that interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary team that we're providing is exactly what we're bringing you today. So one of the strengths, one of the beauties of COVID has allowed us to bring you this expertise and to share this science in the most timely fashion we can via webinar, wherever these experts are in the country. And today's is following in that footsteps. We're bringing you a medical microbiologist and a civil building expert, in engineering and ventilation expert, and expertise in respiratory protection, with their work contributing to the changes that are taking place real time, and ASHRAE and CSA, et cetera. So I really just did want to welcome everyone and get to the logistics piece of today. The flow for today we will have the speakers, and we will have a Q&A session after each speaker, because they will be needed to leave and may not be present at the end, where we will also have a panel Q&A. Kevin Hedges has graciously offered to help introduce some speakers after our first, and Alec Farquhar, who's been carrying the torch with us at OCAO, was part of the Campbell Report in the SARS era and worked at OCAO and OWA, and is leading activist and advocacy, is going to say some closing remarks with regard to some work around that, and a letter from the scientific community that he'd like to give us updates on. So we will have that happen right before 3. And then if others want to continue and speakers are still here, of course, the Q&A can continue after that, but we will ensure that each speaker has a Q&A after their session. We have a panel with closing remarks, and we'll allow that Q&A to follow where we can. So I'm just checking the chat window there, my apologies. As far as logistics go, I mentioned before, we're going to keep video off for most participants, trying to keep, if you would help us with that, trying to keep video for our speakers for the Q&A session. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our first expert speaker, Dr. Raymond Tellier. Dr. Tellier obtained a BSc in physics from the Université de Montréal and an MSc in mathematics from McGill University. He then obtained an MD degree and an MSc in microbiology from the Université de Sherbrooke. He did his internship at McGill University and his residency in medical microbiology at the University of Toronto. He then did postdoctoral studies at the National Institute of Health in the hepatitis viruses section. Dr. Tellier worked as a medical microbiologist for 12 years at the Hospital for Sick Children and the University of Toronto. He was a medical microbiologist for 10 years at the Laboratory for Public Health of Alberta and Calgary, and a member of the faculty of the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. He is currently a medical microbiologist at the McGill University Health Centre and associate professor at the Division of Infectious Diseases in the Department of Medicine at McGill. Dr. Tellier has published 112 peer-reviewed scientific articles. His research interests include molecular diagnostic methods in virology, hepatitis viruses, respiratory viruses, opportunistic viral infections of the central nervous system, and emerging viruses. And I did, just before I hand over the torch to Raymond, I want to thank him. And please check out our previous off-COVID sessions on the same website that you registered on. We've been trying to spread this word since July, since the beginning of the pandemic, around transmission and aerosolization, and translating this science into vernacular is no easy task that everyone will listen to. And we recognize that that's one of the major barriers, is that the experts that's why the strength of the multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary team is so important, because hearing one another's language is a barrier, from infectious protection to occupational health and safety. And today we're trying to tie that together in a hierarchy of controls, focusing on air and filtration with the PPE. So welcome, Raymond.
Thank you very much for this very kind word of introduction. So what I'd like to talk about today are the route of transmission of respiratory viruses, and especially of the COVID coronaviruses, because it laid the ground for strategies to obstruct the transmission of the virus. So respiratory viruses in principle can be transmitted, we think, through three routes. One is the so-called contact transmission, which can be direct or indirect through fomites, contact with secretion containing the virus, followed by self-inoculation, typically by contaminated hands, and then you touch your respiratory mucosa or the mucosa of the eye. Transmission can also occur through large droplets that fall quickly on the ground, or it is thought that it can also occur by aerosol-sized droplets, which are so small that they fall very, very slowly. They linger in the air, they can follow airflow, and they can pose, in some circumstances, a danger for long-range transmission. What is the case is that when you are doing things such as coughing or sneezing or shouting, the secretion in your respiratory system, or the fluid that lines the mucosa, will be broken down, and you will be expelling a large constellation of droplets of various size. Some of these droplets are so-called large droplets that are large enough that they will fall quickly on the ground. Others are very small, will remain suspended in the air like aerosols. And if you are in the proximity to the person that is doing these activities, you will be exposed to all the size of these droplets. And we currently are talking about aerosol size from something that goes from about 1 micron or so all the way to 100 micron. If you are infected with a respiratory virus, the virions, the viruses, will be shed into this fluid, the fluid lining the mucosa, the mucus secretion that accompany the disease, and they will be therefore expelled inside these droplets. And even though the droplets are very small, they contain virus in them that are even smaller. But as a rule, viruses are not expelled naked. They're always to be found in a small droplet that is, however, bigger than them. Interestingly enough, normal activities such as talking at a normal volume or even normal breathing will also produce a constellation of particles of several size, although talking at a low volume or breathing will produce mostly aerosol-sized droplets and not large droplets. And so if you want to entertain the concept of transmission of COVID by asymptomatic infected person, you have to consider seriously aerosol-sized droplet, because by definition, an asymptomatic person does not have an abundance of nasal secretion, does not cough, and does not sneeze. This here is an illustration of the length of time that aerosol-sized particle will remain in the air. So this is just the settling time in still air on the 3-meter fall for a variety of particle size. And you can see that the smaller particles, 5 micron or less, which used to be classically considered as the bioaerosol important in respiratory illness, can remain in the air for a very long period indeed, but this is for still air, which in practice it never is, because you always have a disturbance in the air, you have air current, you have the so-called thermal mixing, where you have a small column of hot air that rise in the room and carry with them aerosol-sized particles, and these produce stirring in the air. So these aerosol particles can remain in the air for very, very long. So I have mentioned that we used to be concerned mostly with the smaller size aerosol because they can linger in the air much longer. They can also gain access readily to the lower respiratory tract, whereas larger particles of 20 micron and above will remain confined to accessing the upper respiratory tract. However, it's now understood that a lot of these larger aerosol of more than 20 micron, they do indeed behave like aerosol. They can follow an air current or an air jet, such as the air jet that are produced when you're coughing and sneezing. And these air jet can propel these aerosol particles way beyond the 2-meter distance that is proposed as being safe for COVID transmission. You can see that it exceeds by several meters, up to 7 and 8 meters for coughing. And at some point, these aerosol-sized particles will exit the air jet and start to live their life as an aerosol, lingering in the air for a period of time that is dictated in great part by their size. But because aerosol particle up to 100 micron can follow an air current, this has importance not only for long-distance transmission, but also for the choice of personal protection equipment, because they can follow an air current that would go around the edge of a surgical mask, which will explain why this is important to have specially dedicated protective equipment for aerosols. Transmission of respiratory virus by aerosol is something that has been discussed in the literature for a very long time, and I could speak about aerosol transmission of influenza for hours. I will just mention this capital experiment that was done in the early 60s in the United States, where they demonstrated that you can infect human volunteer with influenza A virus administered as an aerosolized inoculum. And the detail of these experiments shows several things that are interesting. Well, first of all, of course, you can infect someone with aerosolized influenza virus. Second, the infectious dose, the amount of virus that it takes to initiate an infection, is much lower by aerosol than it is by experimental infection with intranasal instillation, which is, if you will, the laboratory simulation of large droplet landing on the nasal mucosa. And last but not least, whereas aerosol transmission reproduces the full spectrum of influenza disease, including in some cases viral pneumonia, the disease that follows intranasal instillation is much milder. And this is reminiscent of a concept that has been introduced in infectious disease by Dr. Donald Milton from the University of Maryland, which is that of anisotropic infection. The idea is that for those pathogens that can achieve infection through several different routes of transmission, the severity of the disease is not the same depending on the route of transmission. And the classical example of that is smallpox. If you inoculate smallpox under the skin, you will achieve a much milder illness that's associated with mortality of 1 to 3% and followed by immunity against smallpox. This is a very, very old procedure called violation that was discovered by the Chinese thousands of years ago as a primitive way to vaccinate the population against smallpox. If, however, you are infected by the smallpox virus through an aerosol inoculum, then you're going to get the full-blown disease, which is associated with a 30% mortality rate. And by large droplet, it's somewhat in between. And another example of infection that manifests an isotropic phenomenon is anthrax, and I put it to you, influenza virus. So when we are asked why should we worry about aerosol if it's not the dominant route of transmission, well, first of all, even if it's not dominant, it may occur often enough that it is a problem. Second, for some disease, it is associated with more severe form of disease, and therefore it is well worth worrying about. We have known, of course, for a long time, we also know that there are other respiratory viruses that can be transmitted by aerosol. We have known since the 2003 outbreak of the SARS coronavirus 1 causing SARS that this virus can be transmitted by aerosol. We also know that another emerging respiratory coronavirus, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, can be transmitted by aerosol. Indeed, it must be transmitted by aerosol because it infects only the lower respiratory tract and large droplet will not deliver it there. And so when we monitored the emergence of yet another emerging coronavirus, the COVID coronavirus, there should have been immediate suspicion that it too could be transmitted by aerosol. There has been by now several studies that have demonstrated the presence of the COVID coronavirus in aerosol sample collected in hospitals. I don't put them all on the screen because there are too many. I just put some of the first few. Now, the detection of these viruses was achieved by molecular methods. And of course, the standard objection to many people who do not consider that the aerosol route of transmission is significant is that you have not demonstrated by isolation of the virus in cell culture that the viruses in the aerosol were infectious. Now, you have to understand very well the technical challenges to do that. Cultivating viruses is not as easy or effective as cultivating bacteria. And it takes a lot more virus to be detectable in cell culture than by detection by molecular method. For example, for the influenza virus, it takes about 400 to 600 viruses to achieve an infection in cell culture, whereas detection by molecular method is between 1 and 10. On top of that, collection of aerosols will often be deleterious to the infectivity of the viruses. For influenza A, we know that collection by impinger will render non-infectious about 90 to 95% of the collected virus. So if you attempt to cultivate virus from an aerosol sample and you fail, that does not give you complete reassurance that there's no infectious virus in the sample. In spite of all these obstacles, there are by now 2 studies that have successfully achieved the detection by culture of COVID coronavirus in aerosol sample. In these 2 studies, they could demonstrate the presence of virus by molecular method in their aerosol sample, and they could also demonstrate that it contained infectious virus by successful isolation in cell culture. One of the group that has published a study, the group of Dr. Lednicki at the University of South Florida, has just recently put in preprint another study in which they asked a volunteer, a person who had recently been diagnosed with the COVID virus, to sit on the driver's seat of a car that was then closed, and they installed an aerosol detector in the car. And lo and behold, they could detect the COVID coronavirus in aerosol sample collected in the air of the car. And in some of their sample, they could also successfully isolate in cell culture the COVID coronavirus, demonstrating that you produce indeed infectious virus in these aerosol. I wanted to present to you this experiment, which is experimental infection of cynomolgus macaque monkeys with the COVID coronavirus. As it turns out, you can infect them with an aerosol inoculum, and although these animals do not become as ill as humans, they are more sick if you inoculate them with aerosolized virus than by intranasal inoculation, which is reminiscent of this anisotropic effect I was telling you about. This is another very interesting experiment which has recently come to the attention of the scientific world. It is still in preprint. The experimental infection of the Syrian hamster as an animal model. As it turns out, you can infect them by the intranasal instillation route. You can infect them through the fomites route by having them entering in contact in their cage with objects that have been contaminated with the virus. And you can successfully infect them by aerosolized coronavirus. And it turns out that these hamsters infected by fomites are less sick than they are infected by intranasal or aerosol route, although in this paper they did not notice a difference between aerosol and intranasal, but you do have some sort of an anisotropic effect because intranasal and aerosol, they are more sick than through fomite transmission. This is another very interesting experimental infection investigation that was done at the Erasmus University in the Netherlands. They have a very strong group of virology there. And you can see that you have a so-called donor ferret in the bottom cage. So this ferret is infected with respiratory viruses. And then you put a ferret that is non-infected on top. The two are not in direct contact. They are connected only through this duct, which is at least 1 meter vertical trajectory here. And you can readily understand that a large droplet could not negotiate the curve and ascend. And if you infect the ferret with influenza A virus, you successfully achieve infection on its upstairs neighbors. And the same is true with the SARS-1 coronavirus and with the SARS-2 coronavirus, that is to say the COVID coronavirus, which demonstrate that in the ferret model, an infected ferret produces infectious aerosols that can infect another ferret in a setting that preclude transmission by direct contact or large droplets. And so why is this important? Well, we know that in order to counter transmission by contact or large droplet, a lot of very sensible precautions have been proposed by public health, which include decontamination of surface, which include hand hygiene, and which include social distanciation, and which include wearing of a surgical mask. You need, however, to do additional things in order to diminish or abrogate the transmission by aerosol. Aerosol that's suspended in the air in a room can be very efficiently removed by ventilation, which in some setting may be advantageously supplemented by air purification through filters. Social distanciation, 2 meters is better than nothing. We know that some circumstances, especially when there is crowding in poorly ventilated room, that may not be enough. Wearing of a mask by the general public is excellent idea because it offers some protection for the wearer, and very importantly, the wearer, if the wearer is infected, will produce a lot less infectious particle of all size, large droplet and aerosol size droplet. However, when you are a healthcare worker that are providing cares in close contact to infected patient, ventilation will not help you, and you are in close proximity, so you will need to take advantage of personal protective equipment that has been designed to protect against aerosol. These are N95 and above. And in the presentation that will follow mine, you will hear a lot more detail about these different modalities to counter the aerosol transmission route. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Raymond. Kevin, you were looking to moderate the Q&A and then introduce our next speaker. And thank you to John for filling in the chat window. You'll see a lot of the scientific papers that Raymond was speaking to. John has included chat in the chat session for additional knowledge.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Dr. Tellier, for that. This is to Dr. Tellier. Thank you. What do you think of the notion of short-distance aerosols that has emerged from the experts at the INSPQ? And that's from Nancy Delagrave. Thanks, Nancy, for the question.
All right, so what is the case here? For the longest period of time, transmission at long range was taken to be the sine qua non of aerosol transmission, and that is very poorly understood. Certainly, if you observe long-range transmission, that implies aerosol because there's no other way to have long-range transmission. However, if you do not observe it, that does not rule out a transmission through aerosol because aerosols, when they are getting away from their source, they will become more and more diluted and they will be removed by ventilation. The viruses that they contain over time, they become inactivated, and it depends also on the infectious dose. So depending on all these parameters are implicated, you may or may not see long-distance transmission. However, what one must never forget is that at close range to the source, you are exposed to large droplet and to aerosol, including small-size aerosol. There are indeed some mathematical models that will demonstrate that at close range transmission by small aerosol dominate over large droplets. And it has an implication on the personal protective equipment. And we all have intuition of that if you think about cigarette smoke. Cigarette smoke is by and large aerosols. The visible part of it will be aerosols, and you can see how they behave. And you know that if you're in a room in which there are a lot of smokers and poor ventilation, at the other end of the room, you will still be exposed to a lot of smoke. If the room is well ventilated and there's only one smoker, far away you'll be fine. But if you're right next to the smoker, you will be exposed to tobacco smoke, which is an aerosol, and the same is true for disease caused by aerosol. There's also one last thing that I like to say about long-range transmission, is that if you have a disease that is very common in the community, the demonstration of long-range transmission is extremely difficult to make. Because imagine, for example, you have a patient on the first floor of the hospital and you have a nurse that becomes infected with COVID on the second floor of the hospital. You say, aha, but that is long-range transmission. However, someone would object very reasonably that how do we know that this nurse was not in fact infected while doing her grocery shopping the night before? And historically speaking, there has been exactly that same debate with smallpox. And it's only at the time of the last outbreak of smallpox in Germany. At this time, there was no smallpox circulating in Germany. They had one patient that was coming back from an endemic country that turned out to have smallpox, and we started a small outbreak in the hospitals, including in some hospital personnel that never were in his room or indeed on his floor. And there was no smallpox at all in Germany aside from this hospital, and people had to conclude that this must have been because of long-range aerosol transmission. But this is indeed very difficult. And you will note that we have seen in the literature some example of long-range transmission of COVID, such as the choir practice or the restaurant in Wuhan. These examples remains few and far between, precisely because long-range transmission of a disease that's very prevalent in the community is difficult to demonstrate, and it takes some special circumstances to demonstrate it, including peculiarities of the ventilation. But however, we must draw the correct lessons from these instances and make sure that the ventilation is such that we never reproduce a setting in which long range or super spreading event linked to aerosol transmission will occur.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tellier. So another question, if that's okay, it's from Rob to everyone. Does a greater dose result in a more severe infection and outcome?
It is not clear. It's reasonable. It's a reasonable hypothesis for some viruses that seem to be the case. The key concept here is the infectious dose, and that once you reach that threshold, you will be infected, and possibly also the site of infection matters. For some respiratory virus, you get a more severe illness if the infection is initiated in the lower respiratory tract rather than if it starts in the upper respiratory tract. But there has been no good demonstration for COVID that having 50 times the infectious dose versus 5,000 times the infectious dose, whether or not it will end up having a difference in the severity of illness. That's not completely clear.
Thank you.
Either way, it's not clear either way. It's a reasonable hypothesis. It's true for some viruses. It's not true for all viruses. And for COVID, I haven't seen good data on that yet.
Great, thank you very much. Did you want to comment on outdoors at all? I know.
Outdoors is a setting where you have almost infinite dilution of the aerosol you will emit, and you have very good ventilation in principle, provided you're really outdoor. Okay, so if you are in the middle of the park and the next person is 50 feet away from you, you're outdoor. If you're on the terrace of a cafe that is enclosed 3 walls out of 4, and you have a lot of people that are crowding in there, you may be topologically outdoor the restaurant, but you are in fact in an environment that's more like indoors. Again, go back to the intuition that you can gain from cigarette smokers. If you are walking in the park and there's a cigarette smoker 10 feet from you, you're fine. You're not exposed to tobacco smoke. If you're sitting at the same table than the smokers who's blowing smoke at you, even though you are outdoor, you will still be exposed. So outdoor is good solely because the true outdoor environment provide very widespread dilution of your aerosol and good ventilation. If you cheat with your so-called outdoor setting so that ventilation is not good, then you may reproduce a crowded indoor environment.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Tellier. Just want to say thank you so much for fabulous presentation as always.